Welcome and thanks for joining us today for the second event in our Back to Business speaker series. I'd like to acknowledge that the Hunter Business Chamber operates across the traditional lands of the Wabakal and Worimi people and pay respect to elders past, present and future knowledge holders. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to any Indigenous people who are joining us online today. This Back to Business series is aimed at assisting people in business with the challenges associated with COVID. And today's topic addresses one of the major challenges, mental health and wellbeing. I don't need to tell any of you how difficult this year has been. We've all had to make massive adjustments on both personal and professional levels to our lives, our businesses, our expectations and our plans for at least the immediate future. It's tough and there's no shame in admitting that. What we hope to do in the discussion today is reassure everyone watching and listening that if you're feeling challenged by what is going on around you in your business and in your life, then you're certainly not alone. And if you feel like things are getting a bit out of control, there are some steps that you can take to regain control and improve your wellbeing. So on that note, I'd like to welcome our guest speakers. Dr. Sally Fitzpatrick is the Acting Program Director of Everymind, a Hunter-based, nationally focused institute dedicated to the prevention of mental ill health and suicide. Among the programs Sally oversees is the Ahead for Business program, which is focused on people in small business. Welcome, Sally.
Thanks, Amy. I'm thrilled to be here.
Jim Chapman is a senior psychologist with member business Auspsych. Is Jim with us at the moment? Jim's still tuning in, but we'll go back to him shortly. He works regularly with clients in work environments through employee assistance programs, business workshops, executive support and tailored workplace programs. And we've also got Jack Ancliffe from Oasis Media working behind the scenes today to make sure the webinar runs smoothly. We'd also like to acknowledge the support for this series of the Newcastle Permanent, which has come on board as a sponsor. The Perm also sponsored our Survive and Thrive series, for those of you who may have tuned into that, and their ongoing support is appreciated and very important in allowing us to provide these services for business. We'll just go to a message from the Perm now.
When things change unexpectedly, we adapt. When things get complicated, we adapt. When we need to do things differently, we adapt. At Newcastle Permanent, we're adapting too, by increasing our Hunter-based call centre team to assist you and help give you some financial peace of mind. Because if one thing's certain in these uncertain times, we're here for you and we're here for good.
We've got Matthew Chantry, who's the Business Relationship Manager with the Perm with us today. So I'll just invite Matthew to say a few words at this point before we get the session underway.
Thank you, Amy, and good morning, everyone. The Newcastle Permanent is delighted to be partnering with the Hunter Business Chamber to deliver the Back to Business webinar series. For 117 years, the Newcastle Permanent has supported the people of the Hunter region, from fulfilling their dreams of owning their own homes through to more recently helping to support the community through the turmoil of COVID-19. We pride ourselves on being here for you and being here for good. Being here for you isn't limited to our individuals, however, as our service and expertise also extends to our SME businesses who are managed locally out of our business banking department. It's been 20 years since the Newcastle Permanent started business banking, and we continue to help fund the dreams and financial requirements of small and medium enterprises within the Hunter region, the North Coast and Central West. A Newcastle Permanent Business Relationship Manager is someone who you can contact and meet with directly to discuss your financial needs and goals initially, and who will continue to support your business as you grow and change. We have some great home loan offers for small business operators who are looking for a competitive offer, and currently we have kicked off our spring home loan campaign where you may be eligible for $2,000 cash back and a range of competitive rates. Our skilled and experienced Hunter-based team of dedicated business banking relationship managers are happy and ready to discuss all your financing needs, both business and personal. So feel free to get in touch either through our website, calling our Hunter-based call centre on 13 1987, or dropping into one of our branches. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew, and thanks again to the Perm for their support of business in this region. We might have another go at having a little look at that video a little later in the session, but I think we might get underway for now. And Jim Chapman, our other panellist, has joined us, so welcome to you, Jim.
Hi, Amy. I'm glad to be here.
Great. Now our panellists are happy to answer your questions today, so please feel free to post questions or comments using the chat function. You're free to leave your camera on if you'd like to do that, but we do ask if you're moving around or answering phone calls just to switch it off so you're not distracting others in the webinar. And we do record these sessions, but we only record the speaker view, so it's only our facilitators and guest speakers who are on screen on the playback video. So we might get underway. Sally, first to you. You're Ahead for Business, through the Ahead for Business program. You're well acquainted with the stresses and the issues that can affect the mental health of people in business. So what are the issues that have really come to the fore that you've seen during COVID?
Thanks, Amy. I think you're absolutely right. It's such a stressful time for businesses right at the moment. And I think there's probably three big stresses which we're hearing mainly from businesses. Firstly, one of the biggest stresses affecting all businesses, but particularly small businesses, I think, is the uncertainty during these unusual times. I know that we're all watching the unfolding events in Victoria. We recognise the huge amount of stress that those level 4 restrictions are having down there. And I think that for hunter businesses, they will also be worried about whether the same thing's going to start happening in New South Wales, whether it's at level 3 or level 4, but whether we're going to head back down the track that we've been at previously or even worse. What we know is that uncertainty creates stress and worry, and that affects our overall wellbeing. So I think that's one of the biggest issues that we hear. I think another really big issue is that COVID seems to be just the latest of a series of adverse events that hunter businesses have been experiencing. We've gone through drought, we've had flooding, we had bushfires earlier this year, and now we're in the middle of a pandemic. And this just creates a level of exhaustion that impacts our well-being in the workplace and in our personal lives. And I think the third big stressor that we're hearing a lot from businesses is just trying to stay on top of the changes required as a result of COVID, in terms of making sure that your business is adhering to the restrictions and the rules around that, but also the governance and information coming from government. There's an awful lot of information out there. Communication can be overwhelming and confusing at times, and that also raises stress levels. So one of the key programs that we have focused on at Everymind is our Ahead for Business project. And Jack, if you can put up the second slide for me, Ahead for Business. Ahead for Business is a digital hub designed by small businesses for small businesses to support the mental health and wellbeing of small business owners, regardless of their setting and regardless of their industry, right across the nation. So we've developed the website for small businesses. We've provided tailored resources, peer support through a forum. There are checkups around personalised action plans that you can undertake. And it really does showcase the voice of small business owners through podcasts, videos, blogs and case studies. We're about to launch the next version of the Ahead for Business website. So it's up there at the moment, the older version, but we're hoping by the end of this week, the new version will be up. And we're really keen to hear from small business owners to let us know about their experience and have their voice embedded as part of the website. So if you're interested in that, don't hesitate to contact me. But Ahead for Business is very much a resource that we would direct small business owners to support mentally healthy workplaces. Thanks, Amy.
So for people to participate in that program, they just jump online. Do they have to sign up or anything? What's the procedure there?
So the website is open to everyone. There are some components of the website which do require registration. If you want to participate in the online forum and have a conversation with other small business owners, that will require registration. And some of the very particular planning does require a level of registration. And the reason we've done that is we want to be able to create an ongoing relationship with small business owners. We want owners to be able to come back, check in on how they're going, update their action plans, check in on their wellbeing, and make sure that they can use the website as a personalised resource. So some of those features are behind a registration wall. Most of the website, though, is completely open to everyone to look at.
Great. Okay, that's a great resource. Jim, might just go to you to ask you about the employee perspective. So what are the main issues for staff dealing with the changes of COVID and the change that it's brought to their normal working environment?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Look, I've talked to a lot of organisations over the last 2 or 3 months, and a lot of individuals. And I guess the first point is that while some people have said we're all in the same boat, in fact, we're probably just actually all in the same storm. And some people are in boats and others are clinging to bits of broken surfboard or whatever they can grab. There's an incredible variety of impacts on people. Some people are actually loving it. They love isolation. They've got secure work. And other people are affected tremendously. In general, though, and I think I've got a slide there if you want to put it up, there are three main areas that can affect people when we're going to this kind of instability and change. And the first one is just the sense of safety. And in that, people have their sense of general day-to-day security somewhat threatened. So, here we go, yep. So there's rational thinking decreases when we're under that kind of pressure, when the stress goes up. And there's a tendency to sort of pull the wagons around and try and protect ourselves. For an organisation to respond to that, the best things we can do is provide people with as much information and communication as we can. As I've often said in forums, communicate, as difficult as that is, because the more actual facts and knowledge people have got rather than rumours and worries, the more likely they are to be able to calm down. And of course, to any extent, and what Sally was talking before about trying to reduce the anxiety, letting people know what the plans are in terms of how risks are being managed, what safety is put in place for staff and customers, etc. Those things, again, help reduce that reaction that we might have that feels our safety is threatened. The second thing is we need to belong. And the sense during this of being isolated, because many people don't like the isolation, the loneliness, the having to maybe, particularly when the shutdown was strong or if it comes back again, manage a number of roles, including children at home and other things at the same time, means there's tremendous pressure and we may not feel connected to what's going on at work. So people require, in those circumstances, reassurance and collegial connection with other staff to try and get themselves through that. In a couple of organisations I've been in, they've had to really quite work hard to build connections between staff who weren't coming to the actual workplace. So they've had things like Zoom morning teas. That's just one example. And the third thing is that we all feel like, there's meaning in our contribution to our work. And when that might be taken away, and I've seen organisations where they've had staff in split teams into two, so staff are off for 2 weeks and on for 2 weeks, that kind of rostering can lead to people feeling like that they're not making a contribution anymore. So to again address that, we need people to understand what they're doing and what importance they're doing is in terms of the role of the organisation. So I guess those are just some very, very general statements, but again, every person has got a different perspective and having a different reaction to it. And if I could say general idea is, to the extent that you can, communicate and ask people how they're going and listen when they answer.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Sam. We'll move on to some strategies to deal with some of those issues shortly, but I think that piece around communication is really important, because I think that particularly managers sometimes think that they should shield the staff that work with them from some of the realities or some of the harsh realities, whereas what you're saying is that knowledge is power, and it makes people feel more part of the team and being able to contribute. Sally, it's probably important for us to understand mental health and wellbeing a bit better. Could you provide us with a bit of an overview of what the terms mental health and mental ill health actually mean and what influences our mental health?
Absolutely, they're great questions. Thanks, Amy. Jack, can you put up slide 3 for me? I think one of the things that's really important to start any conversation around what mental health is about why we even need to talk about it. So yeah, that's the slide. Can you click twice? I think I have animations, thank you, in there. I think it's really important to recognise that 1 in 5 people in Australia will experience a mental illness in any 12-month period. Now that's significant. That is not a small amount of people. And what it does mean is that your business is likely to have people working for you that do experience a mental illness. So understanding what mental health is, what mental ill health and what mental illness is, I think it's really important for small business owners and for managers and for staff more broadly. So let me start with mental health. So mental health, Jack, if you can go to the next slide. It's a really positive concept, and in business we tend to talk more about mental well-being rather than mental health per se. But mental health is really about our own well-being. It's about being able to realise our own potential, to be able to cope with stresses such as what's going on with COVID, to feel like we're working productively and that we're contributing to our communities. It's about the way we think, it's about the way we feel and we act, to be able to do those things as well as to be able to connect with other people, and it helps us understand our world in a helpful way. I think it's also really important to understand that it is culturally defined. So for some communities, they will talk about mental health in a slightly different way. So for example, our Indigenous communities tend to refer to social and emotional well-being rather than mental health. And I think some of our coal communities will very much talk about behaviours and attitudes rather than mental health as an overall construct. So mental health is something that's really positive. We all have it, and it's there for a reason. What people are interested though is what happens or how we move from mental health through to mental ill health and mental illness. So if we move to the next slide, Jack. I think one of the easiest ways to be able to talk about the relationship between these things is that they work on a continuum from positive well-being and mental health all the way through to mental illness. So when I talk about mental illness, what we're doing is talking about a diagnosable illness. So an illness that's diagnosed by a mental health professional, someone specifically trained, whether that's your GP, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, someone like that. And a mental illness significantly affects the way we think, we feel, we behave or interact with others. It gets in the way of us being able to do the things that we need to do in our everyday lives. And it's usually at the more severe end of the spectrum. In the middle between mental health and mental ill health is a mental health problem, and you'll hear people talk about mental ill health in regards to this. And this is where we start to have some differences around the way we think, our cognitive components, our emotions, our social abilities, but they're not quite as severe as meeting criteria for an illness. They often occur as a result of life stresses. So it's not surprising these days to see some mental ill health coming up in the consequence of COVID, but they tend to be less severe and of shorter duration than a mental illness per se. And it's when they do develop into a mental illness that we often want to be able to support people more specifically. Jack, next slide. I think my take-home message really in understanding mental health is that it's not an on-off switch. We can't, mental health is not the absence of mental illness. What we tend to do is move up and down the continuum. And all of us are going to move up and down depending on what's going on in our lives. So in some components of our lives, we may be coping really, really well. In other components, we may not be doing so well and start to move down into some mental ill health. And depending on the stresses in our lives, moving up and down that continuum is really normal. The thing that's important to recognise is when we do shift or when our staff shift and the supports that we can provide to them to be able to help them. So hopefully that helps explain a little bit about mental health all the way through to mental illness. Thanks, Andy.
Okay, that idea of the continuum really does kind of put a context around it. As you implied, a lot of people may be experiencing mental health challenges now in ways that they haven't before because of the extraordinary circumstances that we're going through. What signs or red flags should we look for, both in ourselves and others, to indicate that you may need or they may need some help or strategies to address mental health? Jim, would you like to answer that first?
Sure, and I think Sally's description there was fantastic. The thing I'd add is that there's a bit of a cultural response in that it's great nowadays we can use these terms. A lot of people from the older generation actually look at the word mental illness as being a moral failure, and that there's great shame that comes with it. And I've been working for 40 years, and I can say that in 1980, sometimes very, very difficult to even raise the topic, whereas now many people can come and say, yeah, I think I've got a bit of mental illness going on. So that's great. It's just like having a cold or the flu or something worse, the various degrees of it. So in that if we, and I guess I'm advocating for the more we're open we are to be able to communicate, the more that encourages others. Some of the things, and it's very hard to grab them all in one basket, but what we're looking for in ourselves or others is changes in things like becoming more anxious, making more unhealthy choices, or having new reactions that we don't normally have. If we find ourselves getting irritable, getting resentful, and stewing on the resentment, if we notice people who are withdrawing from social or work environment situations, if we're blaming ourselves, if there's rumination going on where we keep thinking of the same thing over and over again, or wake at night with the same thought going over and over, that's a little bit of a sign we're heading in that direction or someone's going there. If there's sleep disturbance, and of course we all experience that sometime in our life, but if that goes on and becomes significant, if there's an increase in substance use, alcohol or otherwise, or leaning on things like that, or addictions, for example, gambling, anything like that, that we may see in others or notice in ourselves. If there's feelings of being overwhelmed, and if those feelings persist beyond just, because we're all going to feel a bit overwhelmed with a situation like this, but if that lingers and we can't shake it off, or if the thoughts come to people, or if they start talking about the world or others being better off without them, that's a very significant one. And if we ask people how they're going and those sort of thoughts come up, we know we're dealing with important issues. If there's sustained negative or low feelings about ourselves, again, I use the word sustained. And if there are physical changes such as sweating, heart palpitations, shallow breathing, feeling dizzy, getting the shakes, they're all signs, again, of high anxiety and stress, which indicate more is going on than maybe should be going on a daily basis. There's just a few. I mean, there's a list, you could probably put 100 in there, but some of the things that most jump out to people is irritability, sadness, and withdrawal.
And over a sustained period, I imagine.
Yeah. I mean, and some things like, for example, that statement about the world would be better off without me. I wouldn't be looking for that for a sustained period. If that was coming up, I'd be thinking some action needs to be taken. If somebody was withdrawing a bit or feeling a little bit sad, that's kind of normal life. If someone feels a bit overwhelmed for a weekend or a few days, that's not too bad. But if that's the sort of thing that we want to look for if it's sustained.
Sally, is there anything you'd add to that list?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Jim said. Jack, can we put up slide 7? This is a slide that I took from Health Direct, which is a federal website, which I think really nicely summarises what Jim just went through then. I think what's really important to remember is that we're looking for a combination of changes. Any one of these signs doesn't mean that someone has mental ill health. So I know that I have days when my worry or my low mood is higher than usual. That's normal. It's when you start to see multiple signs that are impacting people's work and their personal lives, that's when you might want to really think about having a conversation with them. So what we don't want to do is overestimate mental ill health, but we don't want to underestimate it as well. So starting to look at what is a normal response from people and when that starts to vary. And I think these emojis certainly sort of give you a sense of the sorts of range of areas that you'd be looking at.
Okay, and I guess the message there too is if in doubt, if you think you're veering towards presenting with one or more of those indicators, then sort of perhaps seek some advice. And we will talk a little bit more about where to go to or how to do that later. Let's talk about looking after yourself and your staff and workplace. Sally, self-care is very important. I imagine it's a bit like that situation of putting on an airline mask that you can't really look after anybody else until you've looked after yourself. Can you talk to us a little bit about self-care and why it's important not to overlook your own needs, especially if you have staff who are relying on you to support them?
You're absolutely right, Amy. Self-care is really important, and it's one of the first things that tends to slip once we start to get stressed and worried. But just as we need to look after the health of our business, we also need to be able to look after ourselves. We can think about our well-being a little bit like a bucket. The more holes that are poked into the bucket, the more the water or our capacity to cope and respond is going to be reduced. So eventually the bucket's going to become empty and there is no coping left. And that's a real risk for both the business and our own well-being. So what we want to be able to do is keep the bucket filled to an appropriate level. The levels will go up and down, but we don't want it to get completely empty. So looking after ourselves is a really important part of running a small business, particularly during these stressful times. Now, the thing about self-care is that it's not rocket science. Most people are going to be able to tell you about the things we need to do to look after ourselves. The difficult part, I think, is actually doing them. So, Jack, if you can put up slide 8 for me. My training is as a clinical psychologist, in addition to doing research. And one of the conversations that I will have with almost every single person that I see is there's 4 basics that we need to be able to do to look after ourselves for self-care. Otherwise, everything in life gets really, really hard. So the 4 basics are, and they're not going to be a surprise to anyone, and the reason they're not a surprise is because they work. First one's sleep. Sleep is absolutely crucial to managing stress, but it's also the thing that tends to suffer in stressful times. I don't know about you, but I tend to really start to struggle a lot after successive nights of poor sleep. But developing good sleep habits is like training a new muscle in your body. It takes practice. It's not going to happen after one try. So if you are trying some sleep hygiene, if you're trying to put new practices into place, what you really want to be able to do is keep doing that night after night, and it will make a difference. And what I can do is make sure that Amy has some information around some sleep hygiene tips, which you'll be able to use. I think the second of the really important things for self-care is diet. You know, what we eat affects our physical health, it affects our mood, it affects our sleep, it affects our energy levels, and it certainly affects our capacity to cope. The more that we put things into our body, whether it's food or alcohol, is always going to have an impact on the extent to which we can cope. Exercise, number 3, not surprising to see either, is one of the best ways that we know to manage stress, low mood and worry. Research consistently tells us that moderate exercise is one of the best things we can do to look after ourselves. It doesn't have to be huge. It can be as simple as a 30-minute daily walk. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money. It doesn't have to take a lot of time, but it's one thing that we tend to always put to the back. And it's one of the best things we can possibly do. And I think for me, the fourth one, which is really important, is pleasure. Doing something nice for ourselves and actually noticing that. This is really important, particularly in the midst of a pandemic where we are feeling overwhelmed a lot of the time. This could be something as small as sitting in the sun for 10 minutes and having a cup of tea, but noticing the sun on your skin, noticing the warmth of your cup of tea coming through the cup. It could be playing with your child or grandchild for 10 minutes. But unless we actually take the time out to notice things in life, what we do as human beings is completely focus on the worry. We are hardwired to look the danger. And in a pandemic and when things are tough, we will constantly be looking for that danger and our worry will go up. It then takes a little bit more effort to make sure that we are doing some things that can make us feel okay. It doesn't have to be a huge thing, but a small thing every single day will make a big difference to your well-being. Anything over and above these 4 basics is great. But if you're under stress, if your staff are under stress, these are the 4 to start to focus on.
Okay, yeah, no, there's a good advice there. I know, from my own experience of working from home, sometimes if you've got your head down, you can look up at 5 o'clock and go, oh God, I've been sitting here by myself, for 8 hours with no interaction other than perhaps a Zoom meeting. And I find that, even just getting up to go for a walk for half an hour outside is really good in terms of your mood and making that break between the end of the working day and, the start of your home life, even though you're still in the house. It's sort of an important step. Jim, moving on from our red flags discussion earlier, COVID's thrown up some very specific workplace issues for people like remote working, as I just mentioned, disconnection from colleagues and clients, health fears, job security fears. How do we effectively keep an eye out for each other when we're working remotely or under some other unusual conditions?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. And what you've just said about the walk and the move is part of that, because I've noticed quite a lot of interviews I've done in workplaces. Some people are struggling with the isolation and can't sit down for more than 30 minutes without something interrupting or whatever. Other people end up working longer, harder days and don't have lunch. So we're all having, again, these different reactions to it. What we're talking about is a period of adaptation, because we'd be lucky if this thing lasts a few months. It could last a lot longer. Either way, major changes are happening in our work lives and in our personal lives. So what we know from the research is people who adapt to home working tend to be people who have a set of attributes that we might label self-efficacy. So they're people who are, if you like, self-motivated, self-driven, and tend to take control of things. People who are, and we're all different, who are more needing to have social reinforcement to continue, are more other-directed, are more invested in how I talk things through with people before I understand them, they will really struggle with the isolation. So we're going to get people who really do well and maybe do too well, and other people who really struggle. One of the best metaphors I got was from one organisation in the Hunter that was saying is they felt like they were going from working on a farm to working in a submarine. And what, in extended discussion, because I've worked with them a few times, is they initially thought they'd be in the submarine for a short while. Now they're realising they're going to have to surface and go up and down quite a lot, and they have to basically rig and prepare for that. And that essentially, because an organisation, if you like, is made up of a structure and a set of communications that occur around that and relationships, the structure, and it may still be there, the function is still there, the job still has to be done, but the communication and relationships have to shift. And that's a lot of a softer area in the way an organisation runs. And it means that a great deal of attention has to be going into how we're actually communicating, how are people's communicative and social needs being met in the organisation, who needs what, as I indicated earlier, where people who are on the out for 2 weeks, what they ended up doing was actually coming up with tasks for those people so they could do documentation to keep involved in the roles at work. A couple of other points that have come up quite a lot is that because our work provides regular scheduling of our time, and routine and regularity is something that actually meters our life out and makes it consistent and reliable. We all eat at the same time. Our biological clock really enjoys that. What happens in a situation like this is that a lot of those normal things that set our day up are changed. So there are 5 principles, I guess. I'm just reading off lists here in a way, and I hope some of them remain memorable, but things to think about. The first thing is impose a structure upon your day. Number 2, prepare for that structure so it doesn't get blown wayward. Have your lunch ready, have things ready. Don't just sort of, I'm at home, I'll do it when I get to it. Make sure, as Sally and Amy have said, that you stick exercise in there. And probably most psychologists, we're really great big fans for gyms and everything else, because to get the stress hormones down in our body, exercise is one of the fastest ways of doing that. And anybody who's in stress or worry, we all know going for a walk or a run or anything like that helps us think more rationally. Number 4 is human connection. So somewhere along the way, we need to have positive human connection where we can really talk to people, without holding too much back. We actually need to be able to have honest communication. And that might only be with one person or 2 people, but we need to see where that's factored in. Normally at work, it could be over lunch or with your workmates. Now it might be very different. And finally, the ability to be emotionally assertive. In other words, being able to speak up for your needs when they occur. Because in this situation, people are going to have different and more needs. There's been a few particular techniques I've gleaned from a few organisations that have come up. Things like the Zoom morning tea, a Zoom pizza hour, the Zoom water cooler, which I wasn't quite sure what they were talking about, but I think there was drinking involved. So be careful what you drink. The telephone tree, which I understood was quite effective, and that is people who aren't in connection, instead of going Zoom all the time, what they'd have is, here's 3 names of people, please ring those 3 people and keep in touch with them. And those people can ring other people. So have a little telephone tree. And part of this is actually substituting for the informal communication that often happens in organisations, that is kind of the grease that keeps the wheels going. So people might not say something in a formal situation, but they will offline like that. And also see if, when we change what people are doing, look at the way that role is developed, and that there's a balance of the requirements of the role and the control and resources to complete that role, because that's the just about single major stress employees have in organisations. The other thing is to notice now that whilst a lot of things that we normally experience have shrunken, there are other things that are expanding. And I was very interested I knew there was a boom in Zoom software and so forth, but there's also been a boom in surfing in Australia during the COVID shutdown. So people are going, well, I'm going to, I'm off work, or I'm scheduled out, or things different. I'm actually got time in the day I can go surfing. I'm not sure if that's what we want all our employees to be thinking about, but what I'm pointing to is that the boom exists because there's a complete change in some kind of workflow. So what is it that's growing, and how do we see that, support it, and then utilise it in a positive way in the organisation? And then the final thing, I think it refers to what I said to you before, in terms of communication. Again, if in doubt, ask, communicate, even if you communicate more than you should, and ask questions whenever the thought crosses your mind, rather than coming back later.
Right. Yeah. No. Where would we be without Zoom? Hey. And I can vouch, as a long-time recreational surfer, I can vouch for the boom in surfing as well. I think there's some I looked out and thought I could walk from Merewether to Bar Beach across the water if I could just step from board to board. Well, quite frantic, but good to see, as you say, good to see people out there. Enjoying a bit of nature and a bit of fresh air and a bit of headspace. Now we're getting a few comments too on the chat that people would like to see get a copy of the PowerPoints later. So if our presenters are willing, we can certainly circulate that around. And can I remind everybody, if you've got any questions or comments, please post them on the chat. Our presenters are very happy to answer your questions. Sally, if a colleague or staff member reaches out to you, it's important to know how to respond. It's the "Are you okay?" thing. What comes next if they say yes? Can you tell us a little bit about safe communication?
Absolutely. It is the "Are you okay?" thing, and we are a big fan of that at Everymind and fully support that messaging. Let me deal with a myth first, because when we talk about mental ill health, we often have the fear that people will be scared to talk about it, won't want to talk about it, or us as professionals within our businesses are actually going to make the problem worse. It's not the case. It's the other way around. Reaching out and talking to someone about how they're feeling actually reduces the likelihood of things becoming worse. A problem shared is a problem halved. I'm sure there's a proper phrase in there that I'm not getting right, but it's about providing an opportunity to be able to support people. So I really encourage those conversations. We often, I think, are taught in society not to be able to ask those questions because we fear the response. Either we don't know what to do or we're going to make the case worse. That's not the situation. So I encourage you to have these conversations. So what are the ways to be able to do that? If we can put up slide 9, Jack, that would be great. I think the biggest thing that I can say to you is to be courageous enough to start the conversation and then listen. You don't want to shut people down by telling them not to worry or dismiss their feelings. We often, if we don't know what to say, try to problem solve for people. I know my husband tries to do that for me an awful lot. What we sometimes don't want is people telling us what to do. We just need them to be able to hear what we're feeling and what we're experiencing. So if you're able to acknowledge that, and it's really easy to just use the words back that you're hearing them say. So if you hear a staff member talking about feeling really sad and frustrated, it's okay to use those words back. It sounds like you're feeling really low or you're feeling really sad at the moment. What it does is it makes space for them to be able to communicate what's going on for them. And it gives them the message that you're available to talk and that mental ill health is not wrong. If we can go to the next slide. I think one of the other things that's really important to recognise is that talking about our wellbeing, talking about our mental health is one of the best ways to be able to reduce stigma in our workplaces. One of the things that we hear an awful lot from small businesses employees about is that stigma really gets in the way of them being willing to be able to put their hand up and acknowledge that things may not be okay. It can be really hard to speak up and talk when things are not going well, when you're struggling, but not making space for this means that we're giving the message that mental health is wrong, and it continues a lot of other myths. What it also does is it doesn't challenge the perspective that that often circulates in our community. So we often think that people who are mentally ill are violent, they're dangerous. In the news media, we often have those two things linked. If we hear violence, we hear mental health linked with it, and that's not the case. By not talking about mental ill health, we don't create a recovery conversation. Recovering from mental ill health and mental illness is absolutely possible and doable, and we want to be able to support people to do that. We often perpetrate the belief that mental illnesses are the same, or the people who share the same diagnosis will have exactly the same experience. And we overlay cultural myths on top of it as well. So conversations around mental ill health not only encourage the person who's experiencing difficulty to be able to seek support, but what it does is break down stigma in your organisation, which allows people to get help and therefore be able to recover and contribute back to the workplace much more successfully. I think the other thing that's really important to think about is language. If we go to the next slide, Jack. One of the things that often is really important to know is that people with lived experience of mental illness or suicide tell us that there are phrases that aren't helpful for them to hear. So it's much better to be able to say someone has a diagnosis of mental illness rather than say they are crazy, they're a nutter, or they're mad. Much better to be able to describe a death by suicide as someone has died by suicide rather than saying that they commit suicide. So I'm more than happy for these slides to be shared, and these are slides which you can find on the Everymind website and which we particularly engage with the media around being able to describe mental health and suicide. But I think they're really relevant for us to be able to communicate more effectively with people within our businesses. And it's not a hard change to make. It's really important to recognise that we can either increase or reduce stigma by our language, and just by understanding what some of those alternate phrases are can be very supportive to people that you're working with. There's an awful lot of COVID resources available. Jack, if we can just go to the last slide to finish. Ahead for Business has a lot of resources for people in the business-oriented small businesses to be able to seek support. And there's always the major support systems out there. If you're in crisis, you absolutely want to be able to encourage people to go to Lifeline, Beyond Blue, Men's Line, Suicide Callback Service. But there's a lot of other organisations out there. Those slides are available with those connections, or going to Ahead for Business will be able to give you some really good resources that you'll be able to use to support your staff.
Thanks, Sally. Jim, was there anything you'd like to add about having that conversation with people if they say, well, look, actually I am in trouble, and perhaps how to direct them on or refer them on if you feel that, they need more than you can give them?
Look, it's a really serious question for any leader or supervisor or manager, because firstly, they wonder how to open it up. And, as it's been said to me, well, what do I do when someone says, yes, I've got a problem? When we say, are you okay? And so the advice I've often given, which people have said works quite well, is, again, and as Sally said, people feel like they've got to do something. They've got to minimise or sympathise or solve the problem. And those things are not the best things to do. Probably the best thing to do is to listen and affirm the person. And out of that, for a supervisor or manager, we've also got to realise there are boundaries, both in skill and time, that we can apply to this. And what we want to do is build the connection with the person, build the support, and then do everything we can to refer them on to the appropriate assistance, whether that's to their GP or to the EAP counselling service your organisation may have, or to one of the many services that Sally just put up. so the person actually seeks help, and then continue to talk to them about, have you actually reached out? Have you got that professional help yet? Because there are quite a lot of people who will latch onto a supervisor they can talk to, and they just keep coming back as if you're their counsellor, but you're not trained in it. So it can be a very awkward situation. You've got to judge when the timing in that is, but it's very, very important to also be able to maintain an ongoing working relationship as well.
Okay, what strategies, Jim, can you suggest that people use to address anxiety and uncertainty that people may be experiencing at this time?
Yeah, okay. I'll try and zip through these a little bit. I just want to hark back to one of the great thinkers of our time, and that's Tarzan. Now, Tarzan movies, who some of you may recall, I certainly do. He was a white guy who ran around in his Speedos and didn't wear sunscreen. But he would give advice to the baddies, and he'd say, don't run near the quicksand. And of course, being baddies, they always would. And he'd turn up at the end of the movie saying to them, well, whatever you do when you're in the quicksand, don't thrash around. I'll go and get something to get you out. But of course, being baddies, they'd thrash around, and then you just see the black hat floating on the quicksand because they've just sunk under. Now, anxiety is very much like that. So we all experience anxiety. In fact, in some ways, you know, if you haven't had some mental health issues at some stage, you probably haven't lived. So the anxiety is going to be there at varying degrees for us at various times. Where we get to a problem with it is where we get worried and anxious about the anxiety. Like being in quicksand, if we keep thrashing around with the anxiety, fighting it, hiding it, not dealing with it. But if we can go, oh, here's some anxiety. What do I do about anxiety? Oh, well, you know, here's a broken leg. What do I do with a broken leg? I'll go and get some help. Can I fix a broken leg myself? Probably not. Anxiety, I might be able to deal with some of it, but it's there. Let's go and get someone else's input into that. So that's my first principle. And I think there's a slide there, number 4, I'm not sure. Yep. So the other thing about anxiety is that it's very, very easy to get anxious, and it happens very quickly. Getting away from anxiety and reducing it tends to happen in small little increments. And I'll very quickly run through these 8 things that I've drawn from the literature and experience over many years. Again, exercise reduces the stress hormones in our body. We almost always feel less stressed after some exercise. Breathing meditation, which I won't go into now, but just doing calm breathing, and everybody knows about taking 10 quiet breaths in another room when things are getting to you. But an extension of that, mindful meditation. There's many websites of mindfulness that you can go to. It gives you the idea of being able to be with what's going on in your mind. Hobbies and distractions get our mind away from the things that are going on, and we all need that break sometime in the day or the week where we stop thinking about our responsibilities, duties and worries. Research from the Mayo Clinic in the US released last year brought an outstanding example that showed that whilst most sports will give people an extra 2 years to their life, if you do mixed gender social sport like tennis, you will live for 10 years longer. So that's a free tip there, folks, and I'll see you in 10 more years to get you a $5 payment for that. The last 3 are really obvious. That is, and again, research really indicates it very strongly. The bush or nature, the more of it, the better for calming us down and helping us balance ourselves. Music, participatively, if we can, whether that's karaoke or it doesn't matter, any kind of expressive art form that you can do with other people. It can be sitting, drawing together. And finally, if you're sitting home at night and you can watch that intense British drama or some stand-up comedy, I say go the comedy. That's going to help your anxiety more. Those are the things that directly deal with it. Amy, did you want me to talk about the dealing with uncertainty stuff yet, or is that coming up?
Yeah, go ahead. So I think we've got that point. So don't be anxious about anxiety. Just
that's right.
Or hit the karaoke machine instead. That's good advice. If we move on to dealing with uncertainty, that'd be really useful.
Sure. Okay. Now, uncertainty is the number one, Sally mentioned before, it really ramps our anxiety up. There's a slide there for this too, Amy, if Jack might be able to go to it. So uncertainty triggers up anxiety. So where do we start? First step, we've got to find a way to incrementally start chipping away at that anxiety. And that list I gave you before, I often hand out to people and I say, pick 2 or 3 of those and do them 2 or 3 times a week for 10 or 15 minutes and see how you feel. So do anything to start getting the anxiety down. Breathing, singing, running, whatever. Just get some anxiety down. And then when you can, sit down and make a list of what you can control. Because even though we're in uncertainty and there's things happening and decisions being made out of our control, list what you can control, because we often focus on the opposite. And then try and respond strategically, both personally and in your business, with an eye on the big picture. And there's this thing that we call the virtuous triad. It's a kind of funny thing about humans. We've got the capacity of hope, which many other species don't have. And that means that if we can focus on things in relation to these three qualities I've listed here, generally, on an average, people will end up with better outcomes. So the virtuous triad is optimism, a positive view of other people, and the Pollyanna type belief that it will all work out. Now, I would say that that could just be a great idea, but the research has actually stood it out. And I remember 30 years ago, I was working with a colleague who's now a vice chancellor of a university. And I've often joked that our stellar careers matched each other. But I sat down with her a couple of years ago, and she said again that those things were things that got her through some of the toughest times. So I'll try and make that very brief. I know we're running out of time, Amy.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. Thanks for that, Jim. Sally, Everymind's developed programs that provide strategies for coping and addressing mental health pressures. What do you find works effectively, and where can people go to find the support they need once they've recognised that they, or perhaps a friend, might need some extra help?
Thanks, Amy. You're absolutely right. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to be really quick. I have 3 top tips for coping with stress. The first one is about recognising what's happening. Noticing when worry or low mood get in the way of you being able to do the things that you need to do, or your employees being able to do them, is really important. We can't act to change anything if we don't recognise it's happening. So actually taking time to notice or helping people notice is really important. For our employees, for partners, for family members, or for carers, that sometimes mean we need to start that conversation that Jim and I were talking about earlier. Not being scared to do that, but to actually reach out. My second main tip is using those 4 coping strategies that I was talking about before, in which Jim has elaborated on really nicely. But going back to sleep, diet, exercise, and pleasure is the basics. If you can't do anything else, do them. And if you are a leader, modelling those sorts of behaviours is absolutely crucial. And I think finally, and probably most importantly out of everything we've talked today, about is be kind. We're all really living in unusual circumstances. There's no defined roadmap through this. We're all trying to do the very best we can. So kindness to others is really important. But being kind and easing up on ourselves is also as important. We can't expect ourselves to perform as if the world hasn't changed. It has changed, and it will be changed for a while. So give yourself some slack, recognise what we're going through, and be gentle about your expectations on yourselves and others. That's not a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of strength and leadership. The websites that I gave before are going to give you some really nice places to be able to gain some more information. But I would also encourage you to reach out. Everymind can help you with training about mental ill health, wellbeing, safe language, coping strategies. So don't hesitate to contact me, and we're more than happy to engage with your business to be able to do some additional work around the things that I've talked about today.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. And that's some really good advice there on the modelling behaviour too for leaders and managers. I think if you're the one that's got your head down and you're working, all these extra hours and everything, then everyone else is going to feel the same, and they're not going to, go and do the things that you're doing. So I think, setting that example is really important. So unfortunately, I think that is all we have time for today. And thanks to our panellists again, Sally and Jim, for a really great discussion. We will put those slides around. It's been very informative and valuable. We'll also, Sally put up that slide that had a very comprehensive list of the support services available. We've also got just a quick list of some of the 20 well-used 24/7 lines that we'll just throw up on your screen now for you to have a look at for that sort of immediate response. And if you'd like to contact one of our presenters today, we're going to put their details just briefly up on the screen as well. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. We've got one more event in this series coming up. Thank you again to the Newcastle Permanent for their support for this series and for business in general in our region. As I said, we've got a couple more events coming up. We've got one more in this series, Seizing Opportunity. I think that's going to be a really entertaining session. I spoke to some of the people who we'll be speaking to yesterday about their experiences. So they're going to tell us how they've successfully sort of adapted during COVID. So we've got Matt Dillo, the chef at the Deck Cafe, who's been running a fantastic online degustation business. Bronwyn Rundle from Rundle's Tailoring, who many of you may be aware, they've moved into making face masks, and you know, she's putting on extra seamstresses. It's going really well for them. And David Buckley, who's the managing director of Autosmart Rathmines, which they've adapted from doing car products to hand sanitizers and some of the other things that are in need at the moment. So it'd be really good to hear their experiences of pivoting and changing and how it's worked out for them. We've also got a live event coming up. Marty Adnam from Out of the Square Media, a brand and creative expert, is going to present at our first planned live event for 6 months at Noah's on the Beach on Wednesday, August the 19th. So if you're interested in that, you can find details for how to register for that event on our website, as with the Seizing Opportunity one. Thank you again to everyone for tuning in, and we hope to see you again online or in person very soon.